Welcome back to Carbon Trust Route to Net Zero Europe. This is the Understanding and Identifying Climate Risk session. And there's a poll on your screen. You might have seen it. It's a yes, no, or don't know answer. So pretty simple. And the poll is: has your company considered the risks of climate change and opportunities a low carbon future brings to your business? In this session, our expert panel will cover announcements from COP26 and answer your questions, including how do you balance investors and regulators, and what will be the trigger to make reporting common practice worldwide. One of my favourites as well: how can assessment and disclosure overcome greenwashing? Gregorio Giorgi from the Carbon Trust will be moderating this session. Gregorio, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ralph, and good morning all, and welcome to this very exciting panel discussion on how understanding climate risk and disclosing the impact that it could have on your business is a key pillar that can support transition to net zero. So a key theme of the event today and the vast majority of conversations and announcements from COP have been predominantly around corporates and financial institutions looking to assess and reduce their impact on the environment. So we're seeing a lot of commitments around measuring Scope 3 emissions, around setting decarbonization targets, about engaging with suppliers and investees companies. But there's another key consideration that everyone should be aware of and should really make, which is the opposite side of the coin. And this is the impact of this fast-changing environment will have on businesses, on financial institutions. So in other words, what are the key risks and opportunities, of course, that climate change and the way the society responds to it pose to the global economy and the global financial system? So as we know, climate change will manifest through physical risk in the form of extreme weather events like storms, flooding, and we see a lot of those already happening today, as well as longer-term, more chronic type of changes to the climate, such as sea level rise or increasing temperature. But also how we respond to these threats, how we look to mitigate these, will also present some transition risks that relate to key policies that will be implemented, low carbon technologies that will disrupt the status quo, the way things are done today, and other changes in market dynamics. So everyone is exposed to climate-related risk in one form or the other, but at the moment, the degree to which one is exposed is not being transparently reported or disclosed in financial markets. And this prevents investors and other players along the investment chain, asset owners, asset managers, from making the right decisions when it comes to allocating their money, allocating their capital. So as of today, climate risk remains very much unpriced, and we very much face an informational market failure due to the lack of clear, consistent, comparable, and transparent information on what is the impact of this climate change onto the business, onto the economy. But things are changing, and we're seeing, a framework that is really becoming mainstream now. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the framework that was developed by this task force, which started off back in 2017 very much as a voluntary disclosure framework. Now it's being mandated across the world in many different countries in official reporting requirements, including the European Union, of course. But is that enough? And how much should companies proactively seek to understand and disclose their exposure to these climate risk and opportunities versus waiting for the market or the regulation to push them, to force them to do so? And what information is actually decision useful, is actually helpful for investors to have at their hand when making this decision about investments? So these are some of the key questions and things that we'll try to answer in the next 30 minutes or so. Before I do, I'd like it to give it over to our panelists today and give them a few minutes to introduce themselves. So over to you, Katarina. Should we start with you?
Sure, happy to. So, I think it was a very interesting meeting and a very interesting COP. It was an encouraging start, but there was also I think there is the big theme is obviously coal, and the big topic is, has it been watered down? Is there risk of actually the positive outcome being escaped through the back door? But I also, it was very unfortunate that there was the wording change from phasing down to phasing out. And I think there is one at Carbon Tracker. We look at these issues on a risk basis for investors. We are a non-for-profit organization. We guide investors through the energy transition with looking at implications and risks and viability of assets and transition plans. So if I look through this COP, I think risk has not necessarily decreased with what we've seen so far.
Thank you, Katarina. Just for everyone's, so everyone is aware, Katarina is the head of research at Carbon Tracker Initiative, which is a financial think tank based here in London. David, could you spend a minute or two introducing yourself, please?
Yeah, great. So thanks so much for having me here. I'm David Carlin. I lead climate risk and TCFD programming at the UN Environment Programme's Finance Initiative, UNEP-FI. UNEP-FI brings together over 400 financial institutions across the world to work on issues of sustainability and environmental topics that both are relevant in the global scheme, but also in their local communities. We are the conveners of the TCFD program, which I lead, which has a number of offshoots in different countries around the world, as well as the co-conveners of the Asset Owner Alliance, the conveners of the Net Zero Banking Alliance and the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, dedicated to getting institutions in those respective financial sectors toward net zero. And so I was fortunate also to be up at COP, and I think one of the things we were talking about just beforehand was really the greater visibility and expectations from the private sector and what kind of interplay that will have in the future as these private sector institutions are looking to step up to the plate. And now these commitments that they've made need to be acted upon in the ensuing years. But I think it also should be a bidirectional set of signals, not only from government to the market, but also from these market actors to government, saying that we are ready to make the transition. We want this transition to happen. And hopefully that can also advance further and faster the negotiations in future COPs. But I think overall, my views are hopeful, but there is certainly a lot of work to be done, and never enough that was accomplished compared to the urgency of the challenge.
Thank you, David. So I think you both share your thoughts on COP with a change in the coal phasing out and phasing down from Katarina, and this collaboration from within private and public sector when it comes to taking action on climate change. So, which leads on well to the second question, which we're seeing the adoption and the success of the TCFD framework recommendation is subject to both this market and policy push, which you alluded to just a moment ago, David, which from the one hand, regulators are mandating this, on the other, investors are pushing this from their side. And we're also seeing a number of leading organizations that are taking the lead on this and being very proactive about understanding their exposure, because they understand that can ultimately affect their bottom line. And also we're seeing a number of alliances and industry groups that kind of sit somewhere in the middle. So what do you think will be the trigger that will make TCFD reporting common practice and an effective disclosure mechanism along the full investment chain, so from the asset owners all the way down to counterparty level players? So starting off with you, maybe, Katarina?
Yes. Well, as you rightly say, there is a lot of pressure from investors. And I think ultimately, when you get things adopted, it'll come through those people who make the decisions, who hold the pocket strings. So I think the investor pressure will be very important. You clearly have an element of financial regulators and stock market regulators, because you have the lever of listing requirements. If you want to list, you must disclose, and that may start off with new listings and move to existing listings. But you also have alliances that and organizations such as the CA100, which we service, such as the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance and a few others. And again, that pushes towards the same direction, disclosure and transparency. But also don't forget, I think it also goes through the auditors, because investors exercise pressures on the auditing profession. And this is where you might actually see, you see professional responsibility, and you might see direct triggering pressure from that side. It's hard to say this particular event will do this, but you would think it is a gradual pressure. And it is more and more investors and analysts going to companies and asking, what is your assumptions? What are your disclosures? What are your answers to these questions? And you will see a corresponding share price performance if they don't answer.
Hey, what's your view on this?
Well, I think I fully agree with Katarina. I was going to, kind of use a little bit of a three-part structure to talk about what needs to happen, and I think we are nearing the tipping points, which have certainly that term has become, well known in the physical impacts of climate, but I think it's also true in social movements, and it's true here as well, which is to say that there are a few more, I think, big things to happen, but once they do, things will move rapidly. And the three that I would flag, I think, the investor or whether stock exchange or listing entity expectation that reporting is required for doing business with them, I think, is a key piece. And having a few more institutions, we're already seeing certain stock exchanges move to make this part of their practice. I think the second is on a governmental side. We already see with the EU and the UK the requirements for reporting, and I think this will just be, over the next few months, a bit of a shakeout in terms of what exactly is asked for. Similar with the SEC, we've been hearing for months about plans on the potential new disclosure requirements, and that will likely also hit in 2022 in the US. And so having the announcement of this is certainly directionally valuable. What's even more valuable is once the rule comes out and once expectations start coming from that first crop of assessment, I think that's where we begin to get better standardization. That's where we begin to get better information. And then the final piece is about, I think what Katarina was hinting at implicitly, which is use. So we the first two I mentioned are really about requirements, but I think these should not be seen as just reports, but rather as tools for stakeholders in order to assess who is prepared to transition, who is doing their part, who is managing risks effectively, who is pursuing the opportunities necessary, who is transitioning. And until they're used to make decisions, not just within the companies, but by external stakeholders, I think that will be another big shift. And so seeing companies begin to cite that as a rationale from your TCFD reporter, we make our investment decisions based on these things. I think that will really be the final critical piece that should, I hope, really drive this into overdrive. That said, it has been a wonderful few years of going from what was a small voluntary initiative to now one with over 2,300 supporters and a number of the biggest governments in the world getting behind it as mandates.
Certainly, thank you both for your input on that. I think what you were saying, David, there around this is kind of, we're still in early stages of companies and financial institutions adopting this framework. And so far, we have seen varying degrees of the information that comes out of these reports. And hopefully in the next year or so, when this is being mandated across countries, we'll see, as you say, what comes out, and we'll be able to make conclusion around what is actually useful. But what is your view today around what is your advice for a corporate that it's undertaking a risk assessment exercise and they want to disclose, they want to be transparent to their investor, to the stakeholder community. So what information would you say they need to focus on that is actually decision useful with regards to this climate change risk? So maybe start with that. Maybe you, David, and then Katerina.
Yeah, I think that this is important because the TCFD has these 11 disclosures within its 4 pillars. But really, when we think about decision useful, all of these pieces matter. But as far as what I think really moves the needle, it's the ability to compare and to fit the financial information into your assessment schema if you're an investor or an activist or a supervisor. And so understanding the management actions and governance is really important. And to me, those are the things that make the other stuff possible. But I really think it's the quantitative disclosures that are so necessary to build comparability and standardization and say, who are the leaders, who are the laggards? In many cases, there are issues, especially when it comes to emissions reporting on methodologies. I think these can very quickly be subsumed either through the translation of one methodology into another. And this is a case for why transparency really above all else is so important, that if you're going to report in a transparent way, then the methodology you choose should also be transparent and these things should flow through. But I really think the quantitative disclosures, both on what your current financing commitments are, what your emissions, your financed emissions are, or your emissions produced if you're a corporate, as well as what are the financial measures, what are you investing in the future, what are the specific technologies, and what share of those do they make up? So are you following a credible pathway toward decarbonization? I think these are the kinds of quantitative metrics that can allow comparison within industry and can also understand in more of that league table format that many have become so familiar with over the years, to say who really are the leaders and who are the laggards in green finance, in devoting a share of their R&D toward these things, in moving toward new technologies, in climate positive solutions, in reducing emissions with targets. I think these are the types of critical items that we need to really be thinking about and really be expecting to come out of reports for them to truly be useful tools and not just an artifact of a reporting or regulatory process.
What do you make of this, Katerina?
I think some of the this is a very, very important part when it comes to the way we look at the world and we look at corporates. As I said before, Carbon Tracker analyzes the energy transition and the fossil fuel sectors, but also the companies in it directly. And we very much look at how can you avoid risk of your assets stranding. So any disclosures to that are just extremely important. And it's basic things from what are your lifetime assumptions? What are your price assumptions? What are your long-term commodity price assumptions? That gives us an indication on what is actually your view of the world in energy transition. Investors will understand that. How do these assumptions tie in with your guidance that you give to investor? Are you do you have transparent targets? Or is there just a global 2050 target? But 2050, quite frankly, is a long, long time away. In order to assess it for investors, for a company to actually have a credible pathway, you need interim targets, you need milestones, and you probably need some very near-term targets. You need 5-year targets, 10 years. You need bigger and smaller milestones that can actually be measured and traced, where you can report on progress, on tangible topics. Where's your fossil fuel production going? Where are your outputs going? What's your product mix looking like? How does that tie in with your investment targets? So I think it all comes to deliver the hard financials, but those hard financials and your strategy plan need to be reflected in transparent and quantified assumptions so that people can actually build a model on the back of this. I would say this is the most important topic. And then it is about avoid greenwashing, have targets that are not just not vague, but that are consistent. I mean, there are sectors who say they have a net zero target, but then if you look at the actual financial targets, they clearly imply emissions are going to go as pretty much as business as usual, and we're planting some trees, or in some cases, we're planting a forest that's bigger than the size of Brazil. Well, if every corporate did that, there are not that many Brazils in the world. So it's consistency and executability and traceability of disclosures.
Thank you for that. So a couple of key themes were certainly the quantification and credibility and executability. I really like that, Katarina, at the end. So I think if for the last couple of minutes here, we focus on, I think this is all kind of the ideal goal for every corporate. But if you put yourself in the shoe of a corporate and you're beginning this journey on, I want to understand where I'm exposed across the value chain, how much am I exposed, what are the key value chain areas that expose me. So this can be quite a complex and time and resource intensive exercise. So what would your advice be for someone getting started? So they haven't done any assessment to date, or someone who have done a preliminary assessment, but they want to iterate that and improve that over time. What would your advice be on how to get started? Probably start with Katarina.
Okay, was waiting for you. Go ahead. The most important thing is understand where is your current status with regards to alignment with the Paris Agreement. How aligned or unaligned are you? What is your pathway there? Do you have targets in place? But set the targets with, then look at what would a pathway for your company have to look like? Where are your levers, your precise and concrete levers of reduction? Where does your emission profile come from? How does that tie in with your business? Where are the biggest levers in emission reductions? And then go about, and how can we set coherent targets that the business can actually fulfill on the long-term horizon and on a short-term horizon. I do keep in mind, again, at Carbon Tracker, we interact with investors and we speak to them all the time. And most of us actually come from that world in their previous careers. What investors hate more than everything is targets that I don't believe. And there's this great risk at this moment. Everybody comes up with some target, and they're not really meant, or they're not achievable, or they're unrealistic, or they're just tick box exercises. In that case, the risk is they become worthless for the entire industry and everybody. So just make sure you are credible and you actually execute on it straight away, and you have the capacity to show progress and execution.
David?
Yeah, I very much agree with that as well, and I would say that that a goal without a plan is pretty useless, and I think that this is where we are today, is that we have a ton of commitments, and in my work with the GFENS initiative, I think that has been one of the real signal successes over the last few months, has been getting so many institutions, all of the big US banks, banks from around the world, investors, to make these commitments. But this is the beginning. And I think if people believe that they won't be called on these commitments very rapidly, I think they're in for a very rude awakening. And I think through one's TCFD reporting, as well as through your actions, developing that intermediate plan. What are the actions that need to happen now? We talk about 2030 as if it's, if it's a decade away. It's now 8 years, but really, when we're talking in capital intensive industries, these are decisions that are being made today, tomorrow, in the coming year, that are going to have ramifications then. And so understanding not only what one's plan is for 2050, but what are the things you need to be doing today? I think that taking action now is absolutely critical. And to kind of circle back to the initial part of the question, I was leading a program. Somebody was asking, should we wait until we have the data and we can, do a better job on the reporting? And I said, no, you really need to start now. And the reason for that circles back to this, which is action is required now, and incomplete information can't be an excuse for inaction. I think it's absolutely necessary that we operate under uncertainty. This is the reason we have risk management. This is the reason we have strategies. If these things were known definitively, those pieces of our businesses wouldn't be needed. And so I find it so critical that people get started because they learn through the exercise what some of those interim steps are. And as far as taking the first steps, I think using the TCFD framework as a way to think holistically is a great start. As a way to enhance, there's so many resources on good practice from the TCFD hub maintained by the CDSB to work that we've done and others on what good looks like. And I really encourage people to continue moving toward good practice and best practice, but that begins with taking the first step. I think this idea of either waiting around or trying to go from 0 to 60 is very much mistaken. We need both tangible action today and can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good when it comes to disclosure, especially when we have ambitions that are as high and as urgent as we do.
Thank you both. I think we're almost to the end of the session. We have 1 minute left. I did want to have your 1 minute now, 30-second view on how can TCFD be the panacea to greenwashing? How can that be a successful framework in tackling that? So 30 seconds, Katarina, we started with you and then David.
Yeah, so you want me to talk through the effect of the TCFD and how effective can be? Can you sort of just is that sort of what you want me to get?
Yeah, can the TCFD be the solution to the greenwashing, to a lot of the greenwashing we're seeing today?
Yeah, well, I think to a degree it can. I mean, what it does, it sets the base standards. It is quite the tricky thing with this. The base recommendation they are all the right ones. They ask all the right questions, but they're very general and they allow a lot of kind of going around and interpretation, which I think is a natural thing for a starting point. But we probably have need for refinement and for more quantification and standardization, because at the end of the day, you need standardized answers. You also need to be able to compare companies. The question is, to what degree can the TCFD do that? Or does the TCFD provide the high level and overarching framework, which then needs to be filled out by the auditing profession, by listing authorities, by investors, by professional standards of industries and tailored to industries, where then it goes much more granular.
Thank you, Katarina. We're running out of time. David, any last thoughts on this?
Yeah, really quickly to say, I think the work of the TCFD has been really important in accelerating progress and information. But how can it be a panacea? I don't think it exists alone. Disclosure needs to be accompanied by action. The way the TCFD disclosures can be most effective is when they are used as a tool, and when they're used as a tool for internal strategy and decision-making, but also by stakeholders to decide how they will base their investment decisions, how they will decide their enforcement actions as supervisors. Those are the things that take this from a reporting exercise to one with real-world impact.
Thank you very much, David and Katarina, for joining us today, and I'll pass it back to Ralph. Thank you all for joining us.